Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This time we're taking a deep dive into Michael Fullen's Change Forces with a Vengeance. You specifically requested this one because you're really trying to get a grip on how to actually make improvements in big, complicated systems.
Yeah, especially in education, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're looking for those core principles, those sort of fundamental truths, without getting bogged down in all the academic jargon that can sometimes make these topics feel inaccessible. So our mission today is to really distill those key insights. We want to get to the heart of how to guide real, substantial change for the better in these challenging environments.
And I think one of the most fascinating things Fullen does right from the get-go is lean on complexity theory. That whole idea that massive systems, especially something like education, can't really be managed in the traditional sense. They have to be more guided. It's almost like, like trying to steer a flock of birds. You can kind of influence their general direction, but you can't control the precise movements of every single bird, right?
That's a great analogy. It really highlights that there's no simple on-off switch for change in these kinds of systems.
Right. It sets up this idea that reform is a much more nuanced and messy process than we often want to believe.
Hmm.
And the book dives into some seriously ambitious questions, like how do we actually achieve better learning, not just for some students, but for all children? How do we make those improvements last? What are the policy tools that actually have a real impact? And what kind of leadership is necessary to make it all happen?
And it's worth noting, for those who might not be familiar with him, that Michael Fullen is a pretty big deal in the world of education reform.
Oh, absolutely. He's a leading international authority on this stuff. He's based at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education and has been working on these kinds of change initiatives globally for decades. So he's not just an armchair theorist.
Right, and his Change Forces trilogy, along with his book, Leading in a Culture of Change, are considered pretty much required reading in the field. They've had a significant impact on how people think about educational change and leadership.
And I think Change Forces with a Vengeance, the one we're diving into today, represents a kind of evolution in his thinking. While his earlier work was very much about understanding the inherent complexity of these systems, this book directly confronts the harder question. How do we actually improve these systems, given all of that complexity? And it starts with the understanding that these systems don't change easily. There's no quick fix, no magic bullet.
And it's not just Michael Fullen saying this. The book has endorsements from some seriously influential people in education. We're talking about people like Michael Barber, who worked with Tony Blair in the UK.
Right. And Richard Elmore, who is a huge figure in educational leadership.
And David Hopkins from the UK's Department for Education and Skills. And they all praise the book for its practical insights and its relevance to making real changes in public schools on a large scale. Barber even mentions that England has learned directly from Fullen's work, and Elmore highlights how the book makes the idea of system-wide improvement understandable. He really emphasizes this idea of changing the underlying institutional context, that kind of foundation, to better support both students and teachers. So it's not just theory, it's grounded in real-world experience and has actually shaped policy.
Right. And speaking of real-world examples, one of the key case studies that Fullen dives into is England's National Literacy and Numeracy Strategy, the NLNS. At the time he was writing this, back in the early 2000s, it was considered the most ambitious large-scale reform effort in education globally.
Okay, so what exactly was the NLNS? Give us the rundown.
Basically, it was a pretty top-down approach. The government set very specific targets for student achievement in literacy and numeracy and established a bunch of accountability mechanisms to track progress. And then they invested heavily in what they called capacity building, things like large-scale professional development programs for teachers, creating standardized instructional materials, and developing new leadership roles within schools.
So pretty directive, a very centralized approach, it sounds like.
Yeah, very much so. And you know what? The initial results were pretty impressive. Within about 4 years, by 2002, literacy achievement among 11-year-olds had jumped from 57% to 75%.
Wow.
And mathematics scores rose from 54% to 73%. So we're talking about pretty substantial gains, especially considering that this was rolled out across something like 19,000 primary schools.
Those numbers are definitely impressive. It sounds like a success story.
On the surface, it definitely does. But even Fullen points out that they didn't fully achieve all their targets. Writing skills, for example, lagged behind reading, and boys continued to underperform in literacy. So even with this very directed top-down strategy, there were still complexities they couldn't fully control. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Despite these significant improvements in literacy and numeracy scores, teacher and principal morale actually declined during this initial phase of the reform, from 1997 to 2002.
Wait, really? That seems counterintuitive. You'd think those improvements would lead to higher morale.
You would, wouldn't you? And that's exactly the point Fullen is making. You can achieve these surface-level improvements, these positive changes in test scores, but if you don't also address the underlying working conditions of the people who are actually implementing those changes, you can end up with these unintended negative consequences.
Like decreased morale. And that's obviously not sustainable in the long run.
Right. So Fullen digs into the reasons for this morale drop, and he suggests a couple of key factors. First, the fundamental day-to-day working conditions for teachers didn't really change much. They were still dealing with the same workloads, the same pressures, the same lack of autonomy in their classrooms. And second, the literacy and numeracy strategies themselves were primarily focused on those outcomes, those test scores, and weren't really designed to address these deeper issues that were affecting teacher morale and professional satisfaction.
So it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a deeper wound.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And Fullen argues that while improving literacy and numeracy is a critical first step, it really is just a first step to cultivate deeper understanding, to really engage students in their learning, to help them develop those higher-order thinking skills, and even their emotional intelligence that requires more than just mandates from above. It requires significant capacity and genuine commitment from the entire teaching workforce. And this leads to this crucial idea of moving from what Fullen calls informed prescription to what he calls informed professional judgment.
Okay, I'm ready for another definition breakdown. So informed prescription sounds like what we've been talking about, that top-down approach. So what's informed professional judgment?
It's essentially a shift towards greater teacher autonomy. It's about empowering educators to make those instructional decisions based on their professional expertise, their understanding of their students' unique needs, but still within a framework of shared goals and accountability. And Fullen highlights some really important questions that come up when we talk about this kind of transition.
Like what? What are some of the dilemmas inherent in this shift?
Well, a big one is, does a period of this informed prescription, this top-down approach, does that actually lay the groundwork for teachers to then effectively exercise informed professional judgment? Or does it, in a way, hinder their ability to do so by creating a kind of dependence on external directives?
So you're saying there's a risk that after years of being told exactly what to do, teachers might actually struggle to then make those independent, informed judgments.
It's a valid concern. And then there's the very practical question of how you actually make that transition. We can talk about the ideal state of informed professional judgment, but what are the concrete steps to get there? Fullen suggests that certain facilitative system conditions are essential. These are like the building blocks you need. Trust between educators and policymakers, a deeply shared sense of moral purpose, coherence across the various educational initiatives, enough capacity building for teachers and leaders, effective systems for sharing and managing knowledge, and a culture that actually encourages continuous innovation.
It makes sense, right? Those are all pretty foundational for any kind of positive change.
Absolutely. And Fullen brings up a study that was commissioned by the British government. It was conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers back in 2001, and it looked at the working conditions of teachers and head teachers. And their key recommendations were: reduce teacher workload significantly, foster a stronger sense of ownership among teachers in the reform process, and build capacity for change in a way that's actually sustainable over the long term.
So giving teachers more time, more voice, more support.
Exactly. And this really gets at that horizon question that
Yeah.
Fullen talks about, which is, how do you really cultivate that widespread teacher investment? That sense of shared responsibility for improvement.
It's that idea of empowering teachers, not just dictating to them.
Right. And England's experience, the NLNS, offers a really insightful case study. It shows both the potential and some of the potential downsides of large-scale reform. But Fullen also dives into other reform efforts to draw out more lessons about just how complicated change can be, especially in these big systems. One example is the California mathematics reform that was studied by Cohen and Hill.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. There were some mixed results, right?
Yeah. The research showed that while the reform policy did lead to some new learning opportunities for some teachers and students, especially those who really engaged with things like the new curriculum materials, student work analysis, and those state assessments, only a relatively small percentage of elementary teachers actually experienced a significant lasting improvement in their teaching practices. We're talking about maybe 10%.
10%? That's a pretty low number considering the scale of the reform.
It is. And it really highlights that just putting new policies in place isn't enough. It's about how those policies translate into real changes in classrooms. And for that smaller group of teachers who did show significant growth, Cohen and Hill pinpointed some key policy instruments that made a difference. They emphasized this crucial alignment between curriculum, assessment, and teacher learning, all very tightly integrated.
Can you unpack that a bit? What does that alignment actually look like in practice?
Basically, for those teachers, their professional development wasn't just some generic workshop. It was directly tied to the specific curriculum materials they were using and to the ways in which their students' understanding was being evaluated. It created this coherence that's often missing in education.
Right, because teachers are often bombarded with so many different initiatives and demands that it can feel overwhelming and disjointed.
Exactly. And another important finding from Cohen and Hill was that simply increasing the amount of time teachers spent collaborating didn't necessarily lead to better teaching. In fact, they found that stronger norms of collaboration were often linked to reinforcing more conventional ideas about teaching math.
So just throwing teachers together in a room and telling them to talk isn't a solution.
Right. It's about the quality and the focus of that collaboration, the content of those discussions, the knowledge that's being shared. That's what matters. Fullen emphasizes that reform efforts need to prioritize intensive teacher learning that effectively blends external expertise with teachers' own knowledge and experiences from their classrooms.
So it's about striking that balance between bringing in new ideas and respecting the expertise that teachers already have.
Exactly. And Andy Hargreaves, who Fullen cites in the book, raises some important concerns about professional learning communities, those collaborative structures that are supposed to support teacher learning. He worries that some versions of those communities can be quite superficial and don't really impact teaching practices. And he's also concerned that in schools serving poorer communities, teachers might end up being subjected to what he calls performance training, which is often linked to very prescriptive top-down interventions.
So not really empowering those teachers, more about telling them exactly what to do.
Right. And that can actually hinder their ability to move beyond just standardization, beyond teaching to the test. And this connects to Richard Elmore's work, which Fullen also discusses. Elmore emphasizes that even when teachers are motivated to improve, schools often lack a real sense of agency, both individually and collectively, over the organizational conditions that actually affect learning.
Meaning the structures, the culture, the resources, all those things that are often beyond the control of individual teachers.
Exactly. And this is where he introduces the concept of distributed leadership as a way to address this issue.
So not just relying on the principal as the sole leader, but spreading that leadership responsibility more broadly.
Right. And all of this leads to what Fullen calls the ultimate horizon. It's this idea of a deeper, more sustainable transformation of the education system. He paints this picture of a future where informed professional judgment is really flourishing at all levels, where there's this ongoing cycle of inquiry, and where everyone is focused on deepening their knowledge about how students learn, both cognitively and emotionally.
That sounds pretty idealistic, but also really compelling.
It is. But he also acknowledges that we're a long way from that reality in many places. And he describes it as an intellectual journey of the highest order, which requires not only new ideas, but also a tremendous amount of sustained effort, collective learning, and a fundamental shift in mindset.
So not a quick fix.
Not at all. And he argues that there's a critical force that's often missing in these efforts to achieve this deeper level of transformation, a stronger sense of collective moral purpose.
Moral purpose. That's a term we hear a lot in education, but what does it actually mean in this context?
Yeah, it's a bit of a buzzword, but Fullen gives it a very specific meaning. He argues that it needs to go beyond individual teachers' personal commitment to their students. It needs to be this shared, deeply felt commitment across the entire system. And the primary measure of success for him, for this collective moral purpose, is explicitly and relentlessly reducing the achievement gap between high and low performing students. Not just celebrating the high achievers, but really focusing on bringing everyone up. And he argues that this focus on equity is far more important for societal development than we often realize.
Okay, so he's tying this back to the bigger picture, to the health of society as a whole.
He is. And he uses some specific research to back this up. He highlights Doug Wilm's research in New Brunswick, Canada.
I'm familiar with Wilm's work. It's really interesting.
Yeah. He found that there's often much more variation in student performance within individual schools than there is between different schools. So it's not just about comparing schools to each other, but looking at the differences within each school. And this suggests that we need to focus on teacher development at the individual school level, not just on broad school-wide initiatives. And Wilms also found that the most successful schools were those that specifically focused on accelerating the learning growth of their lower achieving students.
So closing those gaps within the school.
Exactly. And Fullen also brings in findings from the PISA study, the Program for International Student Assessment. This is that big international assessment, right?
Right, yeah, run by the OECD.
It showed that in countries that have less segregation between different types of schools, the main differences in student performance are actually found within schools, not between them. And even more significantly, PISA data indicated that the socioeconomic makeup of a school has a stronger influence on student outcomes than individual students' family backgrounds. So the learning environment really matters.
You're saying that context can trump individual circumstances.
In many cases, yes. And this leads Fullen to argue that if we compare countries based on the achievement gap, the rankings can look quite different from just comparing overall average achievement. And he uses the UK as an example. He then ties this back to societal well-being, noting that societies with greater socioeconomic disparities tend to have worse health outcomes overall and are probably less economically productive as well.
So he's making this connection between educational equity and the broader health and prosperity of society.
Absolutely. And he goes on to argue that we need to mobilize the moral purpose of the public. He references Michael Barber's concern that if public education doesn't deliver real quality for all students, more and more people will turn to private education, which could ultimately undermine the entire public system. And he points to research from Bricker and Greenspun in Canada that shows that while the public wants tougher standards and more accountability, they also see schools as vital institutions for social cohesion. They still believe in public education.
It's not just about individual achievement. It's about the role that schools play in building a stronger, more unified society.
Right, and Fullen even brings in this psychological concept called motivational pluralism, which suggests that effective moral purpose involves a mix of both selfish and unselfish motives.
So it's not about expecting everyone to be purely altruistic. It's about finding ways to align a variety of different motivations toward a common goal.
Exactly. So to summarize his key points about moral purpose, it's a powerful motivator for change. It has to be a collective effort. Reducing the achievement gap should be the central focus. It requires solutions at all levels of the system. It's linked to broader societal well-being. And we need to actively mobilize the moral purpose of the public. And he reminds us that a lot of the data on achievement gaps focuses on literacy and numeracy, which are foundational but only a starting point. We need to develop better ways to measure and address those gaps in other crucial cognitive and social-emotional skills as well.
There's a pretty compelling argument, right? That this isn't just about education, it's about building a better society.
Absolutely. And he makes it clear that this focus on moral purpose doesn't diminish the importance of knowledge and expertise. In fact, those two things work together to create a more sustainable and equitable system. And now we get to this really interesting part of the book where he lays out what he calls new lessons for complex change, drawing on the principles of complexity theory. He presents 8 of these lessons, each one offering a different perspective on how to approach change in these kinds of systems.
Okay, I'm ready for some complexity theory wisdom. What's the first lesson?
The first one is about developing a more relaxed attitude toward uncertainty.
Relaxed. That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but the idea is that in these highly dynamic, interconnected systems like education, you can't predict specific outcomes with absolute certainty. Things are constantly changing. So Fullen argues that we need to embrace that inherent uncertainty and shift our focus away from trying to control every detail to nurturing these more subtle, powerful forces that can lead to real change over time.
Okay, so not getting bogged down in trying to predict and control everything, but focusing on those broader forces that can influence the system's direction.
Exactly. And the second lesson builds on this. It's about coherence making. Fullen stresses that this isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing shared responsibility. It's not enough just to have coherent policies written down somewhere. That coherence needs to be felt and experienced by teachers, principals, and administrators in their everyday work.
So it's about making sure those policies actually translate into meaningful changes on the ground, not just existing as words on paper.
Right. And you contrast England's NLNS and Connecticut's teacher development policies, which both had a strong focus on aligning various parts of the system, with California's math reform, which didn't have that same level of coordination. He calls it contrived coherence. It looked good on paper, but it didn't translate into real change at the implementation level.
So the key takeaway is that coherence needs to be experienced, not just designed.
Exactly. And then the third lesson shifts our attention to the power of context in shaping behavior.
And this is where he brings in Malcolm Gladwell's power of context idea from the tipping point.
He does. And the main point here is that we're all far more sensitive to our surrounding environment than we often realize. Even seemingly small changes in that environment can trigger big shifts in behavior. And he emphasizes that we tend to overestimate the role of individual character traits and underestimate the influence of situational factors. So it's less about blaming individual teachers and more about looking at the context in which they're working. And he gives examples from Gladwell about how simply cleaning up a neighborhood can actually lead to a reduction in crime.
So it's about actively changing the environment to support the desired behaviors and outcomes.
Exactly. And then the fourth lesson is a bit of a warning. Premature clarity can be dangerous in these complex situations.
Dangerous. How so?
The idea is that we're often tempted to grasp at simple solutions, those off-the-shelf programs or those overly prescriptive approaches, especially when we're dealing with a problem as complicated as education reform. But Fullen cautions that imposing too much clarity too early can actually stifle creativity and innovation. It prevents the emergence of those more organic, locally grown solutions that are often more effective and sustainable.
So it's about resisting the urge to jump to those quick fix solutions.
Right. And then lesson 5 highlights the growing demand for transparency in education and argues that this can actually be a positive force.
Okay, I can see how some educators might resist that idea. They might see transparency as a threat.
Yeah, but Fullen points out that the public increasingly wants evidence of what's happening in schools. And he argues that instead of resisting this, educators need to become more assessment literate. They need to really understand how assessment data is collected, interpreted, and used so they can have informed discussions about accountability and advocate for the responsible use of that data.
So it's about taking ownership of that transparency, not just reacting defensively.
Right. And then lesson 6 offers a word of caution about relying too heavily on top-down reform strategies.
Even after the initial successes of England's literacy strategy, which was very top-down.
Yes, even then. He acknowledges that some degree of central direction and policy levers are often necessary, but he warns against over-prescription, trying to control every detail from the top. He argues that local interaction, adaptation, and professional judgment are essential for creating order within complexity.
It's that idea of balancing central guidance with local autonomy and expertise.
Right. And lesson 7 emphasizes the importance of mobilizing what he calls the social attractors. These are moral purpose, quality relationships, and quality knowledge.
Okay, unpack those for me. Why are those considered attractors?
Well, moral purpose acts as a motivator, as we've already discussed. It gives people a shared sense of purpose and a reason to work together. Quality relationships, those strong bonds of trust and respect, make it easier for people to collaborate and learn from each other. And then high-quality, evidence-based knowledge is essential for actually guiding those improvement efforts. These 3 things work together to pull people toward positive change.
So they create a kind of positive momentum that can drive the system forward.
Exactly. And then the 8th and final lesson is a bit counterintuitive. Charismatic leadership is actually negatively associated with sustainability.
Really?
Yeah.
That's surprising. We often think of those charismatic leaders as the ones who can really drive change.
They can, in the short term. But Fullen points to research from people like Jim Collins, who studied highly successful companies, and Rakesh Khurana, who looked at the downsides of charismatic CEOs. They found that while charismatic leaders might create initial excitement and achieve some early wins, they often discourage critical feedback, take on too much risk, and fail to develop leadership capacity throughout the organization. And that ultimately makes it harder to sustain those initial gains.
So it's more about fostering that culture of distributed leadership and continuous improvement than relying on a single charismatic figure.
Exactly. And these 8 lessons from complexity theory all lead into Fullen's concept of tri-level reform. He argues that to achieve really transformative, sustainable change, you need to coordinate efforts not just at the individual school level, but also at the district and state levels and in the relationships between those levels.
So it's about seeing the system as a whole, not just as isolated parts.
Right. He brings these ideas from complexity theory about interconnectedness and autocatalysis. This is the idea that a change in one part of the system can trigger a cascade of reinforcing changes in other parts. And he argues that you need more intensive interaction and collaboration within each level, and then a much higher level of exchange and alignment across all 3 levels. So schools can't be working in isolation, and districts can't be ignoring what's happening in schools. It has to be this connected effort.
Okay, so let's break down each level, starting with the schools. What
Yeah.
does deep, sustainable change look like at that level?
Fullen emphasizes that within schools, There needs to be much more frequent and intensive interaction and collaboration among teachers. To address the variation we often see in instructional quality and student outcomes from one classroom to another within the same school. He highlights Elmore's point that schools don't always pay enough attention to how their own organizational structures and leadership practices impact teaching and learning. And he brings in Cohen and Hill's finding that most teachers don't have access to the kind of sustained, high-quality professional learning they need to really improve their practice.
So it's not just about telling teachers to collaborate more, but about creating the structures and providing the support for meaningful collaboration.
Exactly. And he also talks about the importance of communities of practice, these groups of people who share a common interest and commitment to learning together. These communities are crucial for fostering organizational learning and developing expertise. But Fullen also warns against those superficial communities that might just end up reinforcing existing, less effective practices. He stresses the importance of what's called distributed leadership, where leadership responsibility is shared more broadly within the school to make sure those communities are focused on real improvement.
So creating a culture of shared leadership and continuous learning within the school?
Right. And Fullen also draws on the work of John Seely Brown and Paul Duguid to highlight that information doesn't become knowledge until it's shared, discussed, and applied in real-world contexts. So those interactions between teachers, those opportunities to share their experiences and learn from each other, are essential for turning information into actionable knowledge. And he contrasts the ideal educational culture, characterized by this kind of ongoing knowledge sharing, with the realities in many schools, which still struggle with isolation, fragmentation, and a focus on control rather than empowerment. He even references Rolf Stacey's argument that new insights and solutions often come from disagreement and debate, not just from everyone agreeing with each other.
So healthy conflict can actually be productive.
Exactly. He encourages schools to confront their current realities honestly, what Jim Collins calls confronting the brutal facts, but without losing faith in their ability to improve. And he highlights the power of what Collins calls the flywheel effect, this idea of building momentum through sustained incremental progress over time. He notes that it's actually pretty rare for companies to achieve that good to great status, which shows just how deep and challenging this kind of transformation can be at the school level.
So schools need to be honest with themselves about where they are, but also maintain that belief in their capacity to get better.
Right. And now moving up to the district level, Fullen sees the district as this potential engine for change, this force that can amplify and support positive changes across all of its schools.
So not just a bureaucratic layer, but an active driver of improvement.
Right. But he also points out that a lot of districts aren't really living up to that potential. They can end up being what Frederick Hess called an episodic aggravation, meaning they create more problems than they solve. And he analyzes the case of Memphis, where reform efforts relied heavily on external models and charismatic leadership, but ultimately failed because they didn't get buy-in from teachers. And he contrasts that with District 2, which focused on improving instruction, sharing expertise, and building a more collaborative culture.
So it's about fostering those internal conditions for improvement, not just imposing solutions from the outside.
Exactly. He also looks at Baltimore and San Diego, which both saw significant increases in student achievement, but also experienced some negative consequences, like a climate of fear and resistance from teachers.
Right.
And he reiterates the importance of aligning curriculum, assessment, and teacher learning at the district level.
To create that coherence we were talking about.
Right. And he talks about these two different perspectives that district leaders might have, what he calls quasi-behaviorist and quasi-cognitive. The behaviorist approach is more about controlling teacher behavior through rules and incentives, while the cognitive approach focuses on developing teachers' understanding and their capacity to make good decisions. And he circles back to those lessons from complexity theory, emphasizing that district leaders need to avoid premature clarity and focus on shaping those contexts in which schools operate.
So, setting the stage for school-level success.
Right. And finally, we get to the state level. Fullen sees the state as having a huge influence on both districts and schools through its policies, funding, and accountability systems. He presents this sort of generic theory of education reform, where you have curriculum standards, assessment practices, and teacher learning all aligned at the center, and then all of that is driven by a clear moral purpose and a commitment to developing high-quality knowledge. And then he points out this catch-22 that often comes up. You need that deep commitment from teachers and principals to make this work, but it can be hard to get that commitment up front, especially when you're asking them to do things differently.
Because change is hard. And
Mhm.
people are often resistant to change, especially when it feels imposed on them.
Exactly. And so Fullen lays out 3 sets of policies that he thinks are crucial for the state to put in place. The first set is about aligning curriculum standards, assessment systems, and teacher learning opportunities. The second set focuses on improving the quality of the teaching profession overall. Things like raising salaries, setting high professional standards, and providing better support for professional development. And then the third set, which he argues is often overlooked but really important, is about changing those fundamental working conditions for teachers.
So, giving teachers more time, reducing their workloads, providing them with more support staff, all of those things we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And he even suggests that the traditional classroom structure might be a dead horse that we need to re-examine. That model where each teacher is isolated in their own classroom. And he shares some really interesting insights from workshops he did with educators in England. They identified a bunch of obstacles to moving toward that informed professional judgment model. Things like a lack of trust between teachers and policymakers, not enough confidence or knowledge, not enough time, too much workload, feeling dependent on those top-down directives, not enough leadership capacity, and just a general fear of losing those initial gains that they had made.
So, lots of valid concerns from teachers.
Yeah. And Fullen also presents the strategies that those same educators came up with for overcoming those obstacles. Things like engaging in self-review and action research, building those networks of collaboration and support, getting more targeted training and time for professional learning, developing leadership skills at all levels, and encouraging the government to be more proactive in supporting all of these efforts. So it's not like teachers are just complaining. They're coming up with solutions as well.
That's really encouraging, actually. It shows that teachers are willing to be part of the solution.
They are. And Fullen also talks about the role of technology. He sees it as an accelerator, not a creator of momentum. So technology can be helpful, but it's not going to solve the problem on its own. And he emphasizes the importance of open dialogue and collaboration between the government and the teaching profession. He references speeches by former UK education ministers Estelle Morris and David Miliband, who talked about the importance of professionalism, trust, increasing funding for education, and really strengthening teacher capacity.
So, a more collaborative approach to reform rather than a top-down command and control approach.
Right. And he stresses that accountability has to be reciprocal. It's not just about holding schools accountable, but about the system as a whole being accountable for providing the necessary support and resources. And all of this brings us to the last major section of the book, which is about leadership and sustainability.
Okay, so how does Fullen tie leadership into this whole picture of complex change?
He argues that effective leadership at all levels is absolutely essential for navigating this complexity and making those improvements last. He highlights some key aspects of effective leadership, drawing on his own book, Leading in a Culture of Change. Things like generating positive energy, maintaining a strong moral purpose, understanding the change process itself, building those strong relationships, fostering coherence, and promoting knowledge development and sharing. And he points out that the characteristics of successful leaders in education are actually very similar to the characteristics of successful leaders in business.
So those leadership skills are transferable across different contexts.
Yeah. And he discusses Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence, highlighting those 4 key domains: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And he talks about the different leadership styles that Goleman identifies, cautioning against overusing those demanding and pace-setting styles, which can actually demotivate people.
So it's not just about being tough and demanding, it's about being emotionally intelligent, building relationships, and creating a positive and supportive environment.
Right. And he also references a study by the Hay Group that compared successful business leaders with highly effective head teachers. They found a lot of similarities in their leadership approaches, but also acknowledged that leading schools presents some unique challenges. And he highlights Richard Hackman's research on what makes teams effective. Heckman identifies these 5 essential conditions: having a real team with clear boundaries, a compelling direction, which aligns with moral purpose, an enabling structure, a supportive organizational context, and expert coaching. And he argues that a leader's main job is to create and maintain those conditions.
So setting the stage for success rather than just trying to micromanage everything.
Right. And he also discusses the Hay Group study of what they call maverick head teachers in England. These are highly successful but often unconventional leaders who take risks, connect different parts of the system, share leadership responsibility, focus on accountability, and see learning as an ongoing process. And then he dives into this really interesting